to really ask those questions and comments. The honourable member for Carleton.
The member across the way mentions that the islanders, the people who live close to Kingston, who live on the islands, are angry when they don't get mentioned. And for that, I apologize, and I will herever after refer to his riding as Kingston and the Islands, if only he will do one thing, and that is promise to end the carbon tax on those islanders who have to fill up their boats with gasoline in order to transit themselves where they're going. I think he would, that way, if I would say the full riding name and he would put an end to the carbon tax, the people right across his riding would be just happy as clams, Madam Chair. And so I invite him to do that in the spirit of compromise. We reach across the aisle. But in all seriousness, if the member wants to bring an end to my speech, he can do so. There are two things. There's one thing I'm asking for in order to stop this speech. That is for the Liberal government to agree to bring all of the participants in the SNC-Lavalin cover-up scandal before a parliamentary inquiry. We can do it at Justice Committee, we can do it at Ethics Committee, but we have to do it because Canadians are demanding we get to the bottom of this scandal. Now, I digressed from the previous argumentation I was making that if this Liberal government is re-elected, Canadians will pay massive tax increases. And I was just finishing up talking about how the government refuses to reveal the true cost of a $50 a ton carbon tax. But what I was about to progress to from there is that $50 is just the beginning. The government has admitted that in the year 2023, which will happen after the next election, it plans to increase the severity of the carbon tax. So that will kick in the mandate of the next government. But this Prime Minister expects you to vote for him in October without knowing how high he will raise the tax. So even if you believe that a $50 a ton carbon tax will only translate into a $600 bill for the average Ontario family, and I don't believe that, but even if you do, you have to be suspicious about how much he will increase the tax rate after the next election. Now, documents produced for the Finance Minister suggest that the tax will have to increase in severity at that time. Other documents produced by officials for the Environment Minister suggest the tax will rise to as much as $100 a ton in the short run and $300 a ton in the long run. That latter price would be 15 times higher than the tax is today. According to the government's own numbers, a $300 a ton carbon tax would translate into a cost of $5,000 for a family of 2 people in Saskatchewan, or $3,000 for a family of 2 people in Ontario. Now, if you've inherited a big family fortune, like the Prime Minister has, a trust fund, and you've been able to shelter your money from taxes, as he did for so many years, while his trust fund was able to grow and multiply without counting against his own income, then you might not worry about a $5,000 carbon tax in Saskatchewan or a $3,000 carbon tax in Ontario. But for everyday Canadians who struggle just to get by, for single mothers, for seniors on fixed incomes, for the small business owner of a pizza shop from Finley Creek in my riding, I can tell you, Madam Speaker, $3,000 is one heck of a lot of money. And the people I'm speaking to, as I knock on thousands of doors in my Carleton riding, tell me they're just getting by. They're not getting ahead. Yes, they're getting by. They're paying their mortgage, barely. They're paying their property tax, barely. They're filing their income tax, regrettably. They're just getting by. They cannot afford a $3,000 a year carbon tax. Now, I have to give the Prime Minister some kudos for his Machiavellian scheme, because he, under guidance of Gerald Butts, have come up with a scheme to get them through the election. You know, because it is quite audacious to try to go in an election right when you're bringing in a massive new tax on people's energy use. So how are they doing it? Well, they're going to give people a few bucks in rebate checks before the election, and then hit them with thousands of dollars in higher taxes after the election. So it is very clever, right? So people think, you know, look, yes, gases and home heating are going up by 10% or so. Yes, the groceries are getting more expensive, but I've got this little check for, you know, $100 that arrives just a few months before the election. I guess that'll get me through till October. And then after the election's over, surprise! The carbon tax is a lot more expensive than you thought it was. But guess what? Too late to do anything about it. It's like buying a product at a store and only finding out the price they charged on your credit card after you make the purchase. Oh, and there's no return policy. You're stuck with it, paying for it for 4 years. That's the Prime Minister's scam. It is the carbon tax cover-up. Give people some assurance before the election, and then raise their taxes after the election when the Prime Minister no longer needs voters but still needs their money. Now, this tax increase will cost people a fortune, and the Prime Minister knows something about fortunes. He inherited one. He inherited a multi-million-dollar family fortune from his grandfather, who ironically made his money with an empire of gas stations. The same gas stations where the Prime Minister's tax is taking effect today. And I want to say the Prime Minister's grandfather was an example of a great Canadian, an entrepreneur, somebody who started from, I understand, reasonably modest means, but went out and built something great. And he passed that fortune down through Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who, as a result of his father, didn't have to work a day in his life, and then on to this Prime Minister, who has enjoyed a similar privilege. Now, the Prime Minister kept that fortune in a trust fund, and it was called a testamentary trust fund, which had a special tax treatment that allowed him to avoid paying the same tax rates on that income that other Canadians would have to pay. And he kept it in that trust fund right through until 2014, when he rose in the House of Commons and actually voted against a bill by the former Harper government that got rid of the trust fund loophole. So ironically, the Harper government was getting rid of this trust fund loophole, and the current Prime Minister, then an opposition MP, stood up and voted his personal interest to keep that loophole in place. And after all, why should you be surprised he had benefited from it for so long? But I say this because I think it gives us a window into his state of mind. He believes that there is no such thing as scarcity, that you can just get money from someone else, make others pay for your mistakes. You know, people who come from a working class background, who grow up with their parents saying, look, Johnny, you can ski or you can skate, but you can't do both, okay? We can go to the cottage, or we can go to Disneyland, maybe, but we definitely can't do both. That's the basic scarcity that most middle-class kids grow up with. And so when they get a job, they have to pay off their student debt, and they know there's scarcity. And so they make responsible decisions in their early 20s to pay down that debt so that then they can get a mortgage and buy a house. And people who have grown up with those kinds of preoccupations have a different outlook than this Prime Minister, who's never had to worry about money. He doesn't worry, he's never had to worry about his own money, so he doesn't worry about anyone else's either. And that has informed the fiscal policy that he brings to the floor of the House of Commons. But in the real world, where people have to work for a living and have to live within their means. They understand some basic things, like you can't borrow your way out of debt, you can't tax your way to prosperity, and you can't just make others pay for your mistakes. They understand those basic rules of life that have allowed them and all of us to build an unprecedented level of prosperity in this country and in countries like ours. It's the free market system, right? You know, it's the basic idea that through the voluntary exchange of work for wages, product for payment, interest for investment, people trade what they have for what they want, and because there's a willing and voluntary partner on the other end of the transaction, everyone's always better off when they do. If I have an apple and want an orange, you have an orange and want an apple, and we trade, we each have something more valuable to us than we had before, even though between us we still just have an apple and an orange. And that is the genius of the voluntary system of free exchange and free enterprise. The Prime Minister doesn't believe in free enterprise. He believes in crony corporatism. He believes economic resources should be moved around by government, that economic decisions should be political rather than voluntary, that we should move money by mandatory taxation rather than by voluntary exchange. And we see that in the crony corporatism that he has played out as Prime Minister. You know, he gave a $400 million interest-free loan to his friends at Bombardier. Well, what effect did that have? Well, the company, since getting that taxpayers' money, has moved the jobs to South Carolina and the intellectual property to Europe. So in other words, South Carolina got the jobs, Europe got the intellectual property, and Canadian taxpayers got the bill. So what would have motivated him to do something like that? Well, it turns out that the billionaire Bombardier Baudouin family owns 53% of the company's shares. Normally, when a company like that is short of cash, they sell more shares. But that would dilute the interest of the billionaire family and cause them to become a minority shareholder. In that case, this billionaire family would lose control of the company. So instead of issuing more shares, they asked the government for a handout. And they had a willing partner in this Prime Minister who was happy as a clam to give it to them. So instead of using the free market system where resources are allocated based on the voluntary decisions of investors, consumers, and workers, he used the government system where he coerced $400 million out of the pockets of taxpayers and gave it to a favored few. And the difference between these two different approaches to economics is this. In the free market, you get ahead by having the best product. In crony corporatism, you get ahead by having the best lobbyist. In the free market, your business has to obsess about pleasing customers. In the government-run economic system, your business gets ahead by pleasing politicians. I don't know about you, Madam Chair, but I think we'd all be better off if businesses saw their interests as being intrinsically linked to pleasing customers, rather than being linked to appeasing politicians. You know, we hear a lot of talk about inequality from our friends across the way. It's one of their favorite excuses for growing the size and cost of government. Of course, government is, to them, they claim, is this wonderful Robin Hood. It's just so strange, though, that their Robin Hood always steals from the poor and gives to the rich. You know, they've created something called the infrastructure bank. The infrastructure bank is designed to give low-interest loans, loan guarantees, and investments directly to companies like SNC-Lavalin to protect them against their own bad investments. So this is how it works. Right now, if a large construction company builds a bridge and that bridge goes way over budget, the company has to pay for the loss. It's called a fixed-price contract. Thank God, because when these incompetent CEOs mess up a big construction project, they're the ones, I believe, that should pay for it, not taxpayers. But the infrastructure bank would give that company a loan guarantee so that if they mess it up, the taxpayer will come to the rescue and pay for all of their mistakes. So in other words, we have another example of where these large construction companies and the private equity and investment bankers that back them up will get protected against their own incompetence by the taxpayer. So here you have, again, the same working class person who's already paying tax to fund interest on our national debt, money that will go to wealthy bondholders, will now have to pay for the incompetence of executives and shareholders in construction companies that mess up, go over budget, or fail to deliver their projects on time and on budget. That is yet another example of where big government comes to the rescue of the rich at the expense of everyone else. Oh, and by the way, did I mention that the only company, that the infrastructure bank only has one project so far? And guess what company is involved in that project? Anybody guess? SNC. SNC Lavalin? Did somebody guess? We have a winner over there. Yes, SNC Lavalin was one of the one of the companies involved in the only project that the infrastructure bank has now approved. So I guess we can just call it the SNC Lavalin Bank. A big multi-billion-dollar pile of cash to protect wealthy and corporate interests that have access to government levers. You know, this is an example, again, of how the free market has a solution. The free market is absolutely ruthless with incompetent CEOs. It punishes them brutally, because if they don't deliver a product or a service on time and on budget to the satisfaction of the customer, they get fired. And then the shareholders vote out that executive and put in someone who can properly do the job. But in a system where governments are always coming to the rescue of incompetent CEOs and executives, they get to stay around and suck off the system and bleed everyone else dry. And that is exactly the system of crony capitalism that this Prime Minister is creating, that played itself out in the case of the corporate corruption charges of SNC Lavalin that we are discussing today. They never learn. They never learn. You know how they got caught, Madam Speaker? It's actually really ironic. Points to the cyclicality, the circular nature of history. I'll tell you a story. The story of the sponsorship scandal, where the Liberal Party was engaged in what a judge called an elaborate kickback scheme to flow millions of dollars through a program that was supposedly designed to help fight separatism. That money went to Liberal-linked ad agencies who then flowed the money back to the Liberal Party. Now, it was really funny because a lot of these ad agencies got charged by the RCMP for fraud. But you know who never got charged? Was the Liberal Party itself, even though the party came forward and admitted that it had stolen at least $1 million. To their I guess you could say to their credit, they agreed to pay that money back after they were caught. But strangely, even after that admission, no one charged them. And we got to thinking back in around 2005, why weren't they charged? Stealing $1 million is a crime. And we came to a conclusion. That is because the Attorney General, a Liberal politician, was in charge of prosecutions, in charge of laying formal allegations under federal breaches of the law. And so, naturally, when you have a Liberal politician deciding if the Liberal Party is going to be charged, you run the risk that those charges, when merited, won't even happen. So, along comes Stephen Harper with the Federal Accountability Act. And what did he do? He took the position of prosecutor out of the office of the Attorney General and made it a stand-alone entity. So, Madame Roussel is our top prosecutor, and she has the ability to prosecute any federal crime. And guess what? She doesn't have to ask a politician for permission when she does so. And here's where the problem started for the Prime Minister. He was expecting, through his massive powers, to reach into the bureaucracy and order that SNC Lavalin get a special deal for its $130 million of fraud and bribery charges. And all of a sudden he realized he couldn't do that. We don't live in a banana republic. The Prime Minister can't simply order a prosecutor to call off a trial. So he called his Attorney General and said, "You do it." you go tell the prosecutor to lay off SNC-Lavalin. And she said, you know what? Under the Accountability Act of Stephen Harper, if I were to do such an outrageous thing, I'd have to put it in writing. And that written document would then be published so that any political direction that goes to the top prosecutor in the land must be written down and put before the eyes of every single Canadian so people can judge for themselves. Yep. And because of that change, which I helped pass through the House of Commons back in 2006 as the parliamentary secretary to the then Treasury Board Minister, we were able, this Attorney General was able to prevent this hideous interference in our criminal justice system. So isn't it funny that what tripped up this Liberal scandal was actually the last Liberal scandal? But the Liberal Party never learns. They always go back to their own ways. And, you know, the burned fool's bandaged finger goes wobbling back to the fire, as the old poem says. And of course, here we are again, Liberals burned by scandal, and expecting everyone to cry crocodile's tears for them. Madam Speaker, the reality is, for those people who've been caught up in all of the melodrama of this Liberal soap opera, it is tempting to think that it's all triviality. That, you know, it's an interpersonal spat between a bunch of Liberal politicians, and they're catching lots of media headlines, but really it's all not that important. Let's just ignore it and move on. Get back to talking about the $20 billion deficit or the carbon tax or something like that. And as tempting as it is to dismiss it all as a bunch of interpersonal wheeling and dealing and a soap opera, let us remember this. There's nothing special about, there's nothing unique about the water in this country other than we have a lot of it. There's nothing intrinsic about we as a Canadian people that distinguishes us from the other peoples of the world. Yes, I would say I love Canadians more than any other people, but we're all one species. We're all the same. But what makes Canada enjoy such a superior standard of living, again, is not that we have something special or magical in our water or in our people. It's that we have freedom under the law. A law that has applied to every single human being with a beating heart and breathing lungs ever since the Magna Carta back in 1215. When King John was forced to submit himself to his then subjects and sign into existence the Great Charter, Magna Carta, the Great Charter, and he subjected himself as a king to following the law. And that 800 years that has followed, in which the commoners have met first in green fields, hence the green carpet, we here have passed the law, and an independent and separate judiciary has administered that law. And it has been a tradition that the Crown and all of the people in the court are subject to the law just like everyone else. That is why you might be the greatest and most powerful corporation that ever existed. You might be the wealthiest man on earth. But in the court of law, the mighty are made low. Everybody is equal. So whether you are a homeless person charged with stealing a loaf of bread, or a wealthy CEO charged with over $100 million of fraud and bribery, as is the case with SNC-Lavalin, everybody must face the law. And as soon as we start to accept that it is normal for a prime minister to pick people who are not subjected to the rules. As soon as we say that there's two laws, one for the people and one for the powerful, then we will be in a new and ugly era where we will replace the rule of law with the law of rulers. That is not the foundation of our country, and that is not the way we should ever exist in this country. But unfortunately, the Prime Minister has taken us on a very slippery slope with this unprecedented degree of personal and political interference in a criminal probe by of SNC-Lavalin. Now, I've already gone through a very extensive list of offenses that this company has either pled guilty, that members of the company have already pled guilty to, and that the company itself now faces in court. That brings us to the present here today, where the government is trying to distract from the scandal before it by spraying $41 billion of new spending all across the land in the hopes that Canadians will simply ignore or miss the scandal that is before them today. Now, a member across the way screamed out, "What about the budget? Why can't we just move on to talking about all of the deficits and the tax increases instead of talking about the scandal?" he wonders. The answer is, if he wants to talk about something else, there's a very easy way that we can do that. Tell the truth. Just let all the facts come out. I think if the Prime Minister had done that at the outset, instead of trying to cover it up, instead of stating repeated falsehoods about the affair, if he had instead just stepped up to the plate and revealed everything he had done to interfere with the Attorney General's role and to block this criminal trial for this Liberal Link Corporation, it would have been politically damaging, but at least we would have been able to move forward. But as is so often the case, the cover-up is just as bad as, or perhaps worse than, the crime itself. And hence here we are today, having to pull facts out of the Prime Minister one by one like a rotten tooth. And Madam Speaker, I have a solution to that. That is to bring all of the players who are alleged to have interfered with the Attorney General before the Justice Committee or before the Ethics Committee, and have each and every one of them testify under oath about what they did and what they know. And when that happens, we as Canadians will be able to judge what happened here and whether the Prime Minister is culpable for making it happen. And if he has absolutely nothing to hide, well then surely he will say yes to this request. At the very least, he will succeed in making me stop this speech, which I know that members of the other side are not enjoying at all. And if he cares at all about their well-being, well,
I think Steve likes it.
Although I'm told that on this side there's a different opinion. And it would probably give the Prime Minister great pleasure to disappoint this group over here by bringing an end to my speech and agreeing to end the cover-up. But if he were to simply allow all the witnesses to come forward, then that would put an end to all of this right now. And I await a member of the government rising to his or her feet on a point of order to interrupt my speech and say that they will relent, that they will end the cover-up, that they will open up the committees for a full-scale investigation. And in that spirit, we can go forward and find out what really occurred. If I can reiterate, here are some of the things that we'd like to know. One, the Prime Minister claimed that the Attorney General never warned him that his interference in the SNC-Lavalin scandal was inappropriate. He claimed that he didn't know she was so upset He didn't find out about it until after the story broke in the Globe and Mail. And yet, we have documented evidence going back to September showing that she told the Prime Minister personally, and that she told his senior staff personally, again and again, from September to December, that she was uncomfortable with their inappropriate interference in her role as Attorney General with respect to the SNC-Lavalin criminal trial. We want to know why the Prime Minister looked 37 million Canadians in the eye and told them that he knew nothing of the Attorney General's complaints, that it was all news to him, and that he, and I'm going to quote him, if anyone, including the former Attorney General, had issues with anything they might have experienced in this government or didn't feel that we were living up to the high standards we set for itself, it was her responsibility to come forward. It was their responsibility to come forward, and no one did. We now know that statement delivered at a press conference February 15th was patently false. Why won't the Prime Minister come before a parliamentary committee, put his hand on the good book, and testify to explain why he would have made a comment like that to 37 million Canadians when he knew it was not true? Next, we want to know about the inconsistencies in this scandal. The Prime Minister has offered varying and confusing explanations about why the Attorney General was moved out of her position to Veterans Affairs. First of all, it was Scott Bryson's fault. Remember that old line? Scott Bryson left as Treasury Board President, and so we had to get rid of our Attorney General. It's a whole intricate story of musical chairs that resulted from this one man leaving, even though she wasn't the one who replaced him in his job. But then last week, we heard a funny news story that the reason the Prime Minister moved the Attorney General is because she wanted to appoint to the head of the Supreme Court a respected judge who just wasn't liberal enough. And if he had been more liberal, then the Prime Minister would have been more happy with his Attorney General and would have kept her in that position. But that was the latest explanation on why she was moved out as Attorney General. And on this story goes. And we all know that what happened was, after a period of relentless lobbying, the Attorney General refused to grant a special deal to SNC-Lavalin. In December, on the 19th, she told the top public servant in the Prime Minister's government that she was, quote, waiting for the other shoe to drop. She compared it to the Saturday Night Massacre when Richard Nixon fired his whole staff to try and cover up Watergate. She said, I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop. And then, of course, a month later, it did drop when she was moved out as Attorney General after this collision she had with the Prime Minister over his intention to give a special deal to SNC-Lavalin with respect to the criminal charges it faced for fraud and bribery. So we want to know, what was the real reason the Prime Minister moved his Attorney General? Is the Scott Bryson story still real? Or is it still the current one? Or are we now moving on to the story about her picking judges that are not liberal enough? The former Attorney General has a very simple story, and she stuck to her story. And that story is that she was moved out because she refused to grant a special deal to this company. We want to know the truth in that matter. We want to know about why it was that the Chief of Staff to the Finance Minister repeatedly hounded and used threatening language in writing, text messages we've now seen, to senior staff in the Attorney General's office. We also want to know about this story about jobs the government initially claimed that the reason why the Prime Minister was so anxious to prevent the criminal charges was that SNC-Lavalin would leave Canada if the charges went ahead. Oh, we now know that's not true. The company has a $1.5 billion loan agreement with the Quebec Pension Plan, requiring that it keep its headquarters in Montreal, where, incidentally, it's just signed a 20-year lease on its building and is making major renovations to accommodate its roughly 2,000 Montreal employees. We also know that the company has $52 billion worth of contracts, the 5 biggest construction projects in the country. Madam Speaker, construction projects can't leave the country because the construction has to be done at the construction site. In other words, it's not possible for SNC-Lavalin to get up and ship out tomorrow if it faces charges, and the CEO of the company has confirmed that he made no such threat. Finally, the government keeps claiming that if the charges went ahead, that the company would lose access to federal contracts, costing the company billions of dollars and many, many jobs. But we also know that's not true, because the government in December of 2015 gave an exemption to SNC-Lavalin, allowing it to continue to bid on federal work, even though it had previously been banned because of charges of corruption and bribery. So, in other words, the government has the ability to extend an exemption to SNC-Lavalin again if the company is convicted of corporate corruption. So if it's not about protecting jobs or federal contracts, who exactly is the government protecting with its relentless and endless attempts to get this company off of a trial? It is extraordinary. There are thousands of trials, thousands of charges laid in this country every year, and politicians never get involved in them. Never. It's just not done. If someone comes into one of our offices and says they've been charged with bank robbery or some other offense and asks for our help, we politely show them the door. But yet this company, accused of stealing $130 million from the world's poorest people, knocks on the Prime Minister's office door and says, "Can you help us get off these charges?" And the Prime Minister agrees. Not once, not twice, but 20 times to badger and hound his Attorney General to get the company off of the charges. Now that we know that this was not about protecting jobs, we need to know who are the powerful players that are getting protected by the Prime Minister's attempt to block this trial.
Unfortunately, I have to interrupt.